For the past 9 months, Henry Cole, the son of a tech tycoon in San Francisco, had not spoken a single word. Day after day, he remained silent, ever since the moment he said his final goodbye to his mother at her graveside. At 6 years old, while his friends were busy playing ball and laughing under the sun, Henry withdrew into the corner of his room. His successful father had hired every expert, tried every form of therapy, but all efforts proved powerless. Until one day, amid the clinking of cutlery and glassware, a waitress did something no one could have predicted, and everything changed. Richard Whitmore, Noah's father, was a renowned tech entrepreneur in San Francisco, a man who sought to fill every minute of his day with meetings, contracts, and company expansion plans. To him, the pain of losing his wife was like a violent storm. If he kept moving fast enough, doing enough, and never stood still, perhaps it wouldn't have the chance to swallow him whole. But every night when he stepped through the door of his 35th floor penthouse, Richard fell into a silence so deep that even the sound of his own footsteps echoed cold and hollow. Noah was usually in his own room, the door slightly ajar, a faint stream of light spilling into the hallway, but inside there was only stillness. No laughter, no whispered words, only the fragile presence of a 6-year-old boy who seemed to have withdrawn from the world. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was a void no one dared to touch. Richard had tried everything. He sought out child psychologists, pediatricians, hours-long therapy sessions, even custom-designed communication games. But every effort ended the same way, in silence. Noah didn't resist, but he didn't respond either. Every day, Richard told himself he was doing everything for his son. But deep down, he knew he was also running away. Because facing Noah's silence meant facing his own loss, and he wasn't ready for that. People often think that a wounded child needs grand solutions to heal. A better school, the most advanced therapy, carefully curated activities. But sometimes, what a grieving child needs most is far simpler. Not a plan, not a method, but a person willing to stay, willing to listen even when there are no answers. Before this story continues, ask yourself, what is the most important thing a grieving child needs in order to begin healing? Richard had no intention of coming home that day. A 3-day business trip to Seattle had been canceled at the last minute when his partner rescheduled. He didn't inform his assistant, didn't message the housekeeper, didn't tell anyone at home. Perhaps a part of him simply wanted to step through the familiar doorway and find himself in a space where no one expected anything, where no one asked questions. Driving home, he pictured the usual scene, a long hallway with cool marble floors, the sound of the San Francisco Bay muted by thick panes of glass, and Noah sitting silently in his room, a small, faint figure in dim light. Only the breath of the sea and the sound of his own footsteps breaking the emptiness. But today, as the penthouse door closed behind him, Richard heard something else, a sound unmistakable, one he thought he would never hear again. Could that sound really have come from Noah? Noah had never been like this. For the past 9 months, Richard had only seen his son move with the caution of someone walking on thin ice, each step, each glance, slow and guarded. But now, right in the middle of the penthouse, so familiar for its hum of air conditioning and cold lighting, the boy was clinging tightly to a man's shoulders, his whole body bouncing with each unexpected gallop, bursts of laughter spilling out in uncontrollable waves. Caleb Brooks, the waiter from Whitmore Dining on the ground floor, still wore his black apron, but instead of standing upright behind the counter, he was down on his knees on the wool rug, gripping a silver tray with both hands as though it were reins, weaving quickly through the spaces between the sofa and the glass coffee table. His voice shifted constantly. Sometimes low and gravelly like a sports commentator, sometimes high and ringing like an announcer, introducing a dish, blending into a rhythm that made Noah sway along. His eyes lit, as if someone had switched on a light inside them. Richard stood in the doorway, silent. Caleb looked up, caught his gaze, and gave a small nod, a gesture respectful but without the slightest hint of fluster. He didn't stop the game, nor did he rush to his feet. He simply eased the pace, lowering himself so Noah could slide off to the floor without losing the rhythm of his laughter. What stunned Richard wasn't the impromptu horse race. It was the moment Noah turned his head, the light in his eyes flaring clear and warm in a way Richard couldn't remember seeing for so long. Eyes that had been dim for nearly a year suddenly came alive, as if, with just a little more, they might speak. Caleb gathered the silver tray and set it neatly on the kitchen counter. He didn't say a word to Richard, nor did he explain why he was here on the 35th floor in the middle of his shift. There was a naturalness in his presence, as if sitting on the floor with Noah was the most obvious thing in the world, requiring no justification. Richard realized he knew nothing about Caleb beyond the HR file. 28 years old, experience in several fine dining restaurants, joined Whitmore Dining a year ago. A staff member who usually appeared at investor parties, serving wine with a polite smile. And now, this very man was the one who had breached the wall of silence no one else had managed to touch. None of the dozens of therapies Richard had tried could produce a moment like this. No expert had made Noah laugh so hard he held his stomach. And the strange thing was, Caleb didn't seem to be helping at all. He didn't coax, didn't lead with questions, didn't act as if he had just achieved a victory. He simply was there, ready to be part of the boys' small world. Richard wondered if it was precisely that lack of intention that opened the door. Could it be that Noah could sense who truly wanted to change him, and who simply accepted him as he was? He had once thought he needed a plan, a clear program, a mapped-out path to bring his son back to normal. But watching this scene, Richard realized maybe what Noah needed wasn't a map, but a companion willing to walk alongside him even if they had no idea where the road would lead. Caleb stood, heading back to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Noah still sat on the floor, but instead of retreating into silence, he watched him go, his gaze no longer guarded. There was something in that look, a recognition, a fragile trust that Richard hadn't received in many months. The moment was brief, but it lingered longer than any therapy session ever had. It was like a crack of light just opened in the stone wall, a place where sunlight might slip through if given patience. Richard knew he could not let it close again. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or grab a glass of water, then keep listening. What comes next will surprise you. Comment 1 if you think the story is good, so we know you're still here. 3 days had passed since that afternoon when Richard heard Noah's laughter, and the penthouse was no longer completely submerged in the stillness it once held. It was still quiet, but this quiet carried a different rhythm, lighter, no longer pressing against the walls as if trying to crush them. Richard began to notice something he couldn't quite explain. Every time Caleb appeared, Noah was nearby. There were no greetings, no calls, but the boy's footsteps always led to wherever Caleb happened to be working. If Caleb was wiping down the bar, Noah would sit on the high stool beside him, legs swinging unconsciously. If Caleb was washing glasses, he would stand in the corner of the kitchen, eyes following every movement of his hands. When Caleb moved between the living room and the kitchen, Noah moved alongside him, keeping a small distance but never letting him out of sight. What caught Richard's attention wasn't that Noah was interacting in the conventional sense. The boy didn't ask questions, didn't strike up conversation. But his silence this time was different. It was no longer a wall shutting out all connection, but more like a door left slightly ajar, waiting for someone patient enough to stand outside. Caleb didn't force the door open. He didn't try to make Noah laugh, nor did he employ any psychological tricks. He simply went about his daily work, fully present. When preparing dessert, he would gently slide the plate toward Noah, leaving a fresh strawberry as an unspoken invitation. When pouring lemonade, he would place the ice tray right in front of him so Noah could drop the cubes in, one by one. Each action was small, but each was an opportunity for Noah to join in on his own terms. From a distance, Richard watched it all. He saw for the first time his son reach out and touch another person without being asked. A small hand resting on the edge of the tray, pushing it slightly toward Caleb as if to contribute to the arrangement. The gesture was fleeting, but to Richard, it felt like the first bird signaling spring after an endless winter. No one told Noah this was a connection exercise. No one recorded or scored his responses, and perhaps that was precisely why it was happening. Caleb wasn't treating Noah. He accepted him fully, unconditionally. That acceptance didn't come in the form of promises like, "You'll be okay," but in the fact that Caleb didn't see Noah as a project to fix. He let the boy exist at his own pace, and when the opportunity arose, he simply stepped into that rhythm. Richard gradually realized that for months, he had been looking at his son as a problem to solve. He believed that with enough time and money, he could repair what was broken. But watching Caleb and Noah, he suddenly understood. Some fractures don't need to be patched up right away. They just need someone to sit beside them, so the one who's hurting knows they don't have to endure it alone. In the afternoons when sunlight streamed through the large windows, Richard would often stand in the shadows, observing Caleb wiping down the dining table, folding each napkin into perfect squares, Noah sitting nearby, sometimes just watching, sometimes picking up a spoon to place in the right spot. No one spoke, but the silence was nothing like the silence of the past 9 months. It carried companionship, the warmth of a second breath. Sometimes Caleb would hum a tune, not a famous song, just a nameless melody. Noah didn't hum along, but his fingers tapped lightly on the table, matching the rhythm. It wasn't a performance. No one applauded, no one recorded it. It was simply a shared moment, and for both of them, that was enough. Richard found himself drawn to the way Caleb was present. No rush, no attempt to fill the space with words, no effort to turn every reaction from Noah into a milestone worth noting. His patience was unassuming, yet unmistakable. One morning, as sunlight slanted across the kitchen counter, Richard saw Noah gently place a glass into Caleb's hand, as if offering help. Without looking up, Caleb accepted it, washed it, and placed it on the shelf as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Richard realized that it was precisely because Caleb didn't make these gestures special that they became natural, free from the pressure to repeat them. Perhaps this quiet presence was opening up a different path, not one marked by progress charts, but by small moments accumulating into trust. Richard wondered, if he were brave enough to sit beside his son this way, to set aside plans, to forget measurable goals, would Noah open the door for him too? And if the answer was yes, how long had he been waiting for that? That afternoon, the air in the penthouse carried an unusual quality. Sunlight slanted through the large glass windows, stretching into pale golden ribbons across the marble floor. Caleb had just helped the head chef bring up a tray of desserts to the living room in preparation for that evening's guests. He walked slowly down the 35th floor hallway, the silver tray balanced in his hands, ears catching the faint sound of small footsteps behind him. When he turned, he came upon a sight that was both familiar and strange. A tiny pair of sneakers lay haphazardly at the end of the hall, as if kicked off or slipped free while running. Caleb bent down to pick them up, his palm feeling the soft rubber and the fading warmth of the small foot that had just left it. Right next to them was a white painted door, different from the others in the house not because of its color, but because it carried a feeling of being sealed shut. Caleb's hand brushed the doorknob, cold, unmoving, a solid lock held firm, as if it hadn't been turned in months, perhaps years. A draft of cold air, invisible yet distinct, seemed to seep out from the space beyond. He didn't know why, but the feeling made him stand still longer than necessary, as though he were standing before a frozen memory. When he returned to the kitchen, he placed the shoes neatly by Noah's cubby. As he casually poured a glass of orange juice for the afternoon snack, Caleb found himself asking Richard, who was standing at the kitchen counter reviewing the menu. It wasn't a heavy question, just natural curiosity. "What's that room for?" Richard's response was so quick and final that it seemed to freeze the air around them. He merely glanced over, his face momentarily tightening, and answered curtly, "No one goes in there. Ever." No explanation, no further comment. End of discussion. Caleb didn't press. He gave a slight nod, set the glass of orange juice on the counter, and went back to work. But even as he busied himself arranging items on the tray, he couldn't ignore the weight in his employer's voice. The kind of weight he'd seen in people who were guarding something far too big, far too painful to touch. That night, when Noah was asleep and the house held nothing but the hum of the air conditioning, Caleb sat in the corner of the staff lounge, a cup of warm milk in his hands. The image of the white door returned to him, sharper this time, as if it were waiting for someone to knock. He didn't know what lay inside, but he recognized the feeling. The feeling of a door locked not just by a key, but by layers of memory and fear. He took a small piece of paper from his shirt pocket and wrote, in even, deliberate handwriting, "You don't have to open it right away, but don't leave it closed forever. No signature, no explanation." Caleb walked quietly down the hall, placing the note and a warm glass of milk in front of the door. He arranged them neatly, as if performing a ritual. Then he left no knock, no waiting for a reaction. The next morning when Caleb passed by, the glass was empty and the note was gone. No one mentioned it. But when they crossed paths in the kitchen, Richard's gaze had shifted, not the usual steady coldness, but a faint softening noticeable only to someone truly paying attention. Caleb didn't smile, nor did he give any signal. He knew well that with doors like this, the only thing one could do was to wait patiently outside, so the person inside knew there would always be someone waiting. Richard didn't say it aloud, but from that day on, whenever he passed the white door, his step seemed to slow, and his breathing was no longer so tight. No one else knew, but perhaps, for the first time in many months, he had begun to consider the possibility of opening it. My dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see people joining us from all over the world. That Saturday morning, the first light poured through the glass windows, laying a thin veil of brightness across the kitchen floor like gauze. Noah, with tousled hair and an oversized pajama top, was crouched by the low wooden cabinet beneath the kitchen counter. He wasn't searching for cookies or a carton of milk like other children might. Instead, his small hands pulled out something unusual, a worn voice recorder, its plastic casing darkened with age. From the sink, Caleb tilted his head to look. He stepped over, taking the device to inspect it. The batteries were corroded, the buttons loose, but its compact shape carried something familiar like a fragment of memory belonging to another time. Without asking Noah where he'd found it, Caleb quietly replaced the batteries. A short beep sounded as the machine powered back on, like a heartbeat just awakened. He placed the recorder in Noah's hands, slowly pointing out each button, how to record, how to play back, how to rewind. The small fingers touched the device's surface, hesitated for a moment, then pressed one experimentally. The first sound captured wasn't a voice, but the ring of a spoon tapping against the rim of a cup, a bright, clear tone echoing through the air. All morning, Noah wandered through the penthouse, recorder in hand. He captured the slice of a knife through a crisp apple peel, the faint fizz of boiling water in the kettle, and the rush of wind spilling in from the balcony when the glass door was cracked open. Caleb followed at a distance, never intruding, simply observing. At one point, he spoke, his voice light, as if not to break the boy's concentration. "You can record anything, even silence." Noah didn't reply, but the words seemed to settle in him. His eyes glimmered briefly, as if he'd just received a permission that needed no explanation. That night, as the home settled into a warm, golden glow, Noah sat alone by the large window. Beyond it, the city stretched out, its rows of lights like streams of stars flowing in reverse across the ground. He set the recorder on his lap, his small finger finding the red button and pressing it down. For a few seconds, only the sound of his own breathing filled the microphone. Then, very softly, almost fearfully, he whispered a single word. "Caleb." Just one word, but a sound unheard for 9 months. He sat a while longer, watching the city lights, then turned the recorder off, as if keeping that secret for himself. The next morning, when Caleb came to the kitchen to prepare for his shift, Noah handed him the recorder. He said nothing, just placed it in Caleb's hand and walked away. Caleb frowned slightly, switched it on, and pressed play. Familiar sounds played. The spoon, the knife, the wind, then a brief stretch of silence. And after that, a boy's voice, faint but clear, speaking his name. Caleb stood frozen, his hand gripping the recorder as if afraid to drop the moment. Heat rose behind his eyes, tightening his throat. He had seen Noah smile, had heard him giggle, but this was the first time he'd heard the boy call out, and the name was his. He didn't tell Richard right away, partly to keep the moment untouched, partly because he understood that with steps this fragile, rushing could send them backward. Caleb simply set the recorder down and went on with his usual work, but inside, a quiet certainty had begun to grow. Noah had found a reason to speak again. But why was that reason tied to him, a stranger who just happened to be a waiter? The message from a partner in New York arrived on a still, windless afternoon. Richard read it, his chest stirring as if a door of opportunity had just swung open. It was an invitation to join an investment deal he had long been waiting for, and there was only one time to seize it: a red-eye flight later that very night. Across the kitchen, Caleb and Noah were lining cookies onto a baking tray. Noah's small fingers placed each cookie slowly, his eyes following Caleb's hands as though every movement carried a meaning of its own. The soft clink of the tray against the counter echoed in a gentle rhythm, a stark contrast to the quickening thump inside Richard's chest. He quietly pulled a suitcase toward the door, careful not to let the wheels rolling across the floor disrupt that fragile peace. In his mind, he told himself he was doing it for work, for the future, for financial security reasons that sounded so reasonable, so airtight they could push back any pang of guilt. Late that night, in a Manhattan hotel room, as he unzipped his bag to take out documents, Richard found a small folded paper tucked between the files, a child's drawing, colors messy but the lines firm. On it, a plain trailing smoke, and beneath it, a boy with long streaks of blue tears falling down his face. At the very bottom, in uneven scrawl, were 2 words: Noah, sad. Richard sat frozen, his fingers gripping the paper's edge. Those clumsy lines weren't play. They were a message, simple and impossible to ignore. He folded the paper again, the heaviness settling deep in his gut. Not because of a missed deal, but because he realized the distance between him and his son was still so wide that the boy had to send him messages in crayon. He left the hotel and returned to the airport. The red-eye flight had not yet departed, but Richard didn't buy a ticket for it. Instead, he booked one back to San Francisco, the suitcase in his hand now little more than a meaningless object. When he walked into the house, most of the hallway lights were dimmed. Richard went upstairs and opened Noah's bedroom door. The boy was curled up on the bed, clutching a teddy bear. No tears, but eyes emptier than Richard had ever seen. He sat on the edge of the bed, his voice low and steady, holding himself in check. I was going to leave. I told myself it was for work. But the truth is, I was scared. You've started to open up, And I'm scared I don't know how to be here for you like Caleb is." Noah didn't answer, but slowly, he tilted his head and leaned lightly against his father's shoulder. The tightness in Richard's chest loosened. No words, but in that silence, he understood there are some answers that never need to be spoken. The suitcase stayed at the living room door all night, untouched. Richard stayed. The next day, warm sunlight spread across the kitchen floor. Noah and Caleb sat together again, but this time Richard was there too, watching every movement, every fleeting smile. While running around the table, Noah tripped on the edge of the rug and fell onto the floor. A cry burst out, but what came next made Richard freeze. Amid the sobs, Noah called out, "Daddy." Just 2 words, but they were like a stone breaking through the thick glass that had encased Richard's heart for 9 months. Every wall he had built, every excuse to avoid, all of it dissolved in that instant. Was this the true turning point, or just a fragile flicker of light that needed protecting? That night, the city's sky wore a cloak of black velvet, studded with twinkling gold lights. On the lofty balcony of the penthouse, wind from the San Francisco Bay swept in, carrying the faint salt of the sea. Richard leaned against the railing, a glass of wine in his hand, untouched. Caleb stepped out, his hands still dusted with sugar from the batch of pastries he'd just finished. For a long while, they simply gazed down at the flow of traffic below, a stream of light moving like a river. Then Caleb spoke, his voice even and low, like telling a story he had carried for far too long. He spoke of Mason, a 4-year-old boy he'd once met while working at a small diner in Boston. Mason was a regular, coming in with his mother every Sunday morning. At first, the boy was lively, always grinning and bombarding him with hundreds of questions. Then, one winter, Mason suddenly went silent. No one knew why. His family brought him to every kind of therapy, applied a series of communication techniques. Caleb, then just a waiter, had pleaded with them to give Mason more time to let him exist at his own pace. But no one listened. A month later, Mason was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He passed so quickly that Caleb never got to say goodbye. In his memory, the final image was of a pair of big brown eyes, silent but brimming with something unspoken. Caleb drew in a deep breath, staring into the dark stretch of the city. "I don't want to see that happen again. When I saw Noah, I thought of Mason, and I knew I couldn't turn away." Richard remained silent, his gaze far away. The night wind moved through the space between the two men, carrying both a chill from painful memories and a warmth from truth being shared. Then Richard spoke slowly, his voice catching on certain words. He told of the day his wife died in a car accident on her way home. He had been in the middle of a meeting he couldn't leave. By the time he reached the hospital, it was over. Only a white sheet pulled up past her face. "I thought I was fighting for Noah in every way I could," he said, eyes still fixed on the distance. "But the truth is, I was just trying to patch what was already lost. I was running from my own grief, and I forgot that sometimes all you have to do is be there." The words dropped into the night like a pebble breaking the surface of a still lake. There was no reply, only a quiet empathy spreading between them, connecting them in a way no words could. Caleb set his glass down on the small balcony table, standing beside Richard. They didn't look at each other, but their eyes shared the same view of the city's sea of lights. In that moment, they were no longer employer and employee, but two human beings carrying their own wounds, standing side by side for the same reason. Both knew the road ahead would not be easy. Noah would not instantly return to the boy he once was. But now, Richard no longer wanted to run. And Caleb, with Mason's memory, would not allow the door to Noah's heart to close again. They stood there in the night wind, saying nothing more. Yet in that silence, There was an unspoken promise that they would both stay, not out of obligation, but for the most important reason of all. A child needs to know they have not been left behind. And perhaps that was the true beginning of the healing journey. Maybe what this story leaves behind is not just the journey of a boy reclaiming his laughter, or a father learning how to stay, but also a reminder to all of us. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand plans or perfect solutions. It comes from presence, from choosing to stand beside someone even when you don't know what to say. The room that had long been locked was now open. The lingering scent of perfume, the untouched belongings, none of it erased because the past doesn't need to disappear. It only needs a new space to exist alongside the present. And on the wall, 3 handprints of different colors pressed together with the clumsy but meaningful word, family. Some losses will always leave an empty space, but if we are brave enough to share, to listen, and to stay, that space can become a place where new love grows. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If you also believe your presence can change a life, leave me a comment telling me where and when you're listening to this. Share this story with someone who might need a spark of hope. Because who knows, you might be the one who helps someone open a door that's been locked for far too long.